Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar this afternoon, Strategies to Help People During Change and Transitions. Just a little bit to let you know about how the webinar is going to unfold. There will be a half an hour of a presentation, and at the end, we're going to, I'll open it up for questions. As we're going through, the chat box is there, so if you open the chat, you're welcome to leave any questions as you think of them as we go through, and if they're not answered by the end of the webinar, we will have an opportunity. I'll open the mics, we'll stop the recording, and we'll actually, answer any questions that you might have. So we'll just get started. This is really a great time to be talking about supporting people through change and transition, because as you're all experiencing, this is an unprecedented time of change. The pandemic has challenged us to adapt and to lead in different ways. And I don't know how many of us ever imagined we'd be working from that home or being nervous about going to the supermarket. It's been really a lived experience of transformational change for us. So let me first introduce myself. My name is Michelle Cooper. I'm actually a registered nurse by professional background, and I have been doing organizational development, consulting, coaching, facilitation, training for more than 20 years now. I had my healthcare leadership experience progressively through many organizations. I was in hospitals, home care, and also in long-term care. I've had experience in both not in government, healthcare, not-for-profit, and private organizations. And my specialty is in leadership development, organizational development, authentic engagement, mentorship, and executive and manager coaching. Much of, and I'll say our experience, I'm a partner in an organization called Courage Group International, and we're pleased to be partnering with BEVA on this training program. We've done a lot of work with change, and both small and large change groups, anything from a merger and trying to develop a new culture, right through to looking at new, smaller organizational systems and quality improvements. So let's talk a little bit about change in general. How do we define change? It's a general transition of something or a phase up to another state or condition. It actually implies a movement towards a goal, an idealized state, or a vision of what should be. There's movement. So change implies movement from one state of being away from present conditions, beliefs, and attitudes towards something else. And some may say it's a never-ending process of readjustment and readaptation as we respond behaviorally to the never-ending circumstances. As we're talking about change and change models, we're talking about intended change, but there's also there's the change that we plan, and there's a whole lot of unplanned change, which is what we're experiencing right now. So let's look at the classic models of change. Some of the change management, change models have been around for more than 50 years. And the earlier change models were a little bit more linear. They really were adapted to technical change. And based on a more of a hierarchical and paternalistic worldview that we knew best, and that organizations are systems, organizations are machines, and some of those earlier change models were like an input, throughput, output kind of change. In these models, it's the role of the leader to help people get through a time of disruption and achieve a desired state. So there seems to be a clear beginning and a clear end. Some of the mental models of this change ideas have many hypotheses. That first of all, there's a really clear vision. We know exactly where we're going. We have all the answers to the questions, and the future is knowable. So with technical problems or technical challenges, they can be simple, such as, okay, we need to rewire a house, or they can be adaptive, and adaptive, are complicated. So complicated, still there's some knowing in it, but there might be multiple ways to approach it. Some of the newer models of change that have emerged, including chaos theory and complexity theory, are really nonlinear. They look at change as being a constant. It also acknowledges that change is personal. So you can change a structure, but if you want to change how the structure operates, it's really about the shift in the beliefs and values of the individuals who are part of that change. These kinds of models really are applied to an unpredictable world where the future is a bit unknowable. And we talk about the adaptive leadership, as I was saying earlier. So it's usually people issues. It's something where authority or expertise does not necessarily support us in that kind of leadership. And I like this quote that I found. It's when we're talking about models of change, it's not the toolbox, it's the carpenter, which not only the change models often tell us how we do the change. I mean, what we do for change, excuse me, but it's the carpenter who knows how to use the tools appropriately that can make the change effective and lasting. This quote by Robert Evans reflects what we were talking about earlier in the day. The expected and unanticipated rate of change, technological, social, economic, and political, is growing so rapidly that we can no longer automatically rely on the stability of the classic paradigm in any aspect of our experience. And that's from the human side of schools change. What we've seen in the business literature for a number of years is what they call it VUCA. It's an acronym for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the leadership in a VUCA world is much different than we've seen in the past. So there's always been change. Change is a constant, excuse me. And the VUCA world is what we're experiencing right now. We've talked about it a lot, and this is the lived experience in the pandemic. As you recall, in the earlier parts of the pandemic, what we knew was shifting even by the hour. So we would come up with a plan to deal with it, and by the end of the day, there was a totally different plan that had to be implemented because the knowledge and the understanding of what was happening with the virus was so quick and emergent. So that's the experience of the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. So what can we do as leaders? And leave two questions with you to reflect on just for a moment. What is our role as leaders in these times of uncertainty? And can we guide others if we're uncertain or ambiguous about this change? So I'll just give you a second to think about those two. And I'll share my perspective. Is the role of leaders is to help people to navigate the uncertain times, to model the way, to work with the people side of change, to build organizational and individual capacity and resilience to thrive in change. It's up to leaders to create the psychological safety that enables inclusion, learning, disagreement, and innovation to happen. The leader must authentically embrace change. And the leadership for change cannot be contracted out. Very often, I know, and we're on the receiving end of the hiring, that we can't delegate the responsibility or the leadership for change to somebody outside of the leaders of the organization. Yes, absolutely bring in support and systems experts, facilitation experts, and the leader still needs to be out front leading the change. You know, let's take a real example. If we say that wearing a mask is now an important part of our organizational policies and procedures and systems, then the leader needs to be the early adopter and model the way with that. So we've had a lot of discussion about that in the pandemic, but that is a very small but practical example to say what you think, to do what you say, and to be authentic in leading and showing people how you embrace the change. to be successful today, leaders of the next century will need to run their workplaces first and foremost, building on their skills as architects and organizational designers who now know how to organize the various elements of their organization, as well as facilitators who ensure that these elements work effectively together. So what we're saying here is there needs to be a balance. There's the structure, there's the process, so the task side of change, and there's the people side of change. So there needs to be a balance. So the ability to know how to design, but also to engage people, to lead so others that will follow you in the change. So the research shows that 2/3 of all change initiatives fail. And the number one reason for that failure is the failure to manage the human side of change and stakeholder resistance. So we've been working a lot with William Bridges. He's written extensively about change and transition. And although he's been publishing this and he's updated it a number of times, it's very, very applicable today. What his quote is change is not the same as transition. And a lot of the earlier models focus on the actual change. It is an objective modification of our environment, usually starting with something new. It disrupts the established order and is external to itself and dated in time. So what Bridges says is that it's not the change that gets us, it's the transitions. So living in transition is really what has the impact on people. And a transition begins with an ending or a loss. So the change is actually a stimulus. It's the event. It's something that happens, and then to actually move through the process to create the new beginnings is not a lockstep process. You have to be able to let go of what was, not lose the learning from that, not totally abandon it, but let go of attachment to what was. Then you enter a neutral zone and you have to journey through that neutral zone into a new beginning. And I like this picture of the bird. It just epitomizes that, okay, I've got the new flower, but I'm still hanging on to the old one. And in order to fully embrace that, you have to let go. So this is how people experience change. So change is actually situational, and change happens. Change is, and you can have a change without people transitioning. And that's really illustrated by the quote that don't think anything's changed here. Like you might have changed, but nothing's different. When we have a change, when there's a loss, people enter a grief cycle. And even if the change is a good change, that it actually is, it takes a lot of time. What a lot of leaders make a mistake is if they introduce a change, then they believe the new beginning has happened. And then there's a level of frustration when all of a sudden, a week later, after declaring the change, there's nothing different in the organization. So people go through the transition process, and it really does mimic the grief cycle that we know. Grief of loss of a person or a relationship, any kind of a change produces a loss. As I said, even a good change. Transition is a psychological process, and where people gradually accept the details of the new situation and the changes that come with it. So if we look at on the left side of this model that people go into with the ending, there's a sense of loss. They might have all of these experiences of denial, shock, anger, frustration, ambivalence. And as it takes time, and people will proceed at different rates through that early part of that grief process. It depends a lot on their experience of change, the resilience for change. They're learning what their culture is, what has been the impact of change for them in the past. So people will proceed at different rates, and there is actually not always a linear process, because they might cycle through different pieces of this as this change starts to become more, and the ending becomes more real to them. It is generally a little bit faster than when it's clear, and well, there's not really a clear delineation between ending and the neutral zone. There's a bit of a, the cloud is gray, but a bit of a gray zone there. That is, there is an overlap between the ending and the neutral zone. After you leave the neutral zone, there's a big job to navigate that, and we'll talk about each of these steps. Then people go through a process of accepting. So once people are out of the neutral zone, it doesn't mean that they've actually accepted it. There is a phase and steps for them to, you might see initially skepticism, then maybe some acceptance, and then they'll start to see importance, and maybe there's hope, and then enthusiasm. And that's when you know that the new beginning is there, that people are really engaged and excited and moving forward with the new. So these are, and what we do know too is that there's not ever just one change going on at a time. And while this looks a little bit isolated, and you think, well, there's multiple things going on at the same time. Yes, we often know that we hardly get through one cycle of change when something else is happening, or there might be multiple changes happening at a time. And the other thing to consider is that, change at work is one thing, but people are coming to work, and there's almost everybody in the room is experiencing some sort of grief or loss, whether it be from change or death or illness, and that is compounding their experience of change as well. So it's not the changes, as we say, that cause the issues, it's the transitions. So it's really important that leaders anticipate, identify the possibilities, and prepared for the ends and the losses that are produced by a proposed change. And the transition begins with the letting go of something and an unlearning of old ways. So if you're a little bit like the trapeze artist, there's a quote by Dunan Perry that is, the trapeze artist releases their grip on the one swing with the hope that the other swing will be there to greet them. If not, they might have the wonderful experience of the power of flight. So there's a bit of a risk, there's a letting go, but you have to let go in order to let come. So the first role of leaders and strategies is about helping people cope with the losses. The job of the leader is to determine who loses what. So have some anticipation. It's important to explain the reason for the change. And in fact, it's important to engage people early as possible in that and helping to co-create the change. It's important also to specify in detail what will change and what will not. Often people get fixated on a change when there's a lot that is staying the same. So it's really important for them to ground themselves as to what isn't different, what isn't changing, and what is changing. So what are the implications? Explain it. Identify who will be affected. Identify a collective loss. Part of the job of the leader is to accept that the reality that there's a real importance to the subjective meaning of loss to people and the threat that it produces to what David Rock calls scarf. There's status. How might the person's status be threatened by this change? And certainty. What might be ambiguous to the staff in the midst of these changes? And autonomy. What perceptions do staff members have of their ability to control their activities or their responses, or what might cause them to believe their autonomy is threatened? And relationships. What relationships might be threatened? How might staff feel excluded from the change? Helping people to cope with loss it's about being compassionate. Expect and anticipate and accept grief. People are emotional beings. Loss produces emotion, and there needs to be a place and a welcoming for people to talk about that emotions. And that's what I talked about, that psychological safety to engage, to learn, and to share where they're at. We know that this kind of a loss you can get symptoms of anger, bargaining, anxiety, sadness, disorientation, depression. And as we said, if it's combined with all of the life changes and other grief work that's happening in people's lives, it can be exacerbated. So the job of the leader is also to help compensate for losses. So it's not about artificial compensating, but looking at what really is, what's the new, what's something that they're going to be receiving, what's the gift of the change for that person. And you cannot over communicate. You have to give the information and do it over and over again. And it's an interesting paradox that the more information you give, and the people want lots of information, but the stress of the changes often doesn't enable them to retain it. And not to rationalize. Often we think, well, maybe it's not a good time to inform them. We did announce it once. What's wrong with them? I've told the supervisors it's their job to inform them. I don't know all the details. There's no point in communicating this at this time. So you think about rapid cycle change or even agile change in IT. As change emerges, there's things that are going to be changing. So it's important to keep people abreast of where is the current status all the time. And the other thing is we said earlier, what isn't changing? So some people will embrace the new but hang on to the old. So we're moving from our paper system from a triplicate paper to an online system. Some people won't let go of the paper system. And some people will start to make their own decisions about what to keep and what to throw away. And others will just throw everything out with the bathwater. And it's really important to honor the endings, but also to treat the past with great respect. When people start to resist change, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it's really about them feeling they're attached to what they have. Their identity is pretty engaged with what they did before. And if it's disrespected or discarded, it's important they're going to be more resistant to change because it, again, compounds a threat. And you can honor endings. It's just like in a funeral, you honor where it was, you celebrate the past, and then you do something that marks the new way. And sometimes people take a physical piece of something that was. If you're into a new building, some people bring a brick or something that is representative of what was. And it's a place of telling story. So storytelling is a powerful way to help people shift through that transition from the ending into the neutral zone. And also moving through even into the new beginning. Here's some of the things that are important to think about, and a few questions I'll leave you with. I won't read them through, but it's about studying the change. Do you know what's happening? Have I recognized the losses? Have I given permission to grieve? Is information accurate? Have I clearly defined what ends and what doesn't? Have we have a celebration? Can we mark that end and the excitement and launch the new beginning? And did I really let them know that we have to end in order for the new to emerge? So that once the people kind of are guided through the ending, we're entering into this neutral zone, and it's a little bit like a limbo. The old is not there, but the new has not quite landed. And it's in this time that perspectives, attitudes, values, self-image, ways of thinking that had been functional in the past must kind of, in quotes, die before people are willing to live the present. So there's still some letting go. It's about shifting, but it's also a time when there is a reorientation and redefinition. And it's also a time where, because things are disrupted and it's in a bit of flux and chaos, there's a real opportunity for innovation here. So you can use the energy and start to give people a bit of a lighthouse to move to in their sailboat, so that if you think about navigating on the ocean, even though you're going to be tacking back and forth and things are going to still be in transition, you at least have a good sense of the destination when you get there. The neutral zone is a bit of a difficult time because productivity can drop by 50%. People will miss more work than other times. It's often when the old weaknesses show up, and we'll talk about that in the sense that the whole idea of change produces a threat, and a threat creates a stress response. So here are some things that help to guide people through the neutral zone. Really, it's really important to let people know that it's normal to feel this sense of being lost in the wilderness or being in a limbo, because there is that transition from old to new. And to really continue to have a positive metaphor, a positive story to reinforce it. How do you let them know that they're still belonging and they're still valued? How do you encourage them to innovate and take risks and even actually risk failure in this time? And how can you make sure you're not pushing for certainty and asking closing rather than opening questions? So the new beginning, the start is really not the new beginning. So as you exit the neutral zone, we're starting into another phase. And new beginnings can't be forced. Just as people had to let go, they had a process of letting go, they have to have a process of letting come. That's from Otto Schormer's U theory. So they go through periods of skepticism, so acceptance, importance, hope, enthusiasm. And so what's really important to clarify and communicate at that time is the clear purpose, and have a clear portrait of the future, that there's a roadmap for getting there and a role to play. And it's really most important if people were part of the co-creation of this roadmap and this new future. The more that people are engaged, that you have join in the beginning, you don't have to work so hard with buy-in at the other end. So there's a checklist here for new beginnings. Is this a good time to start, or really doing the litmus test of where you are in the change process? And also understanding there's multiple things going on at the same time. There might be people at various stages at different times on different projects, different changes are happening in an organization. And do people understand their new roles? And are you modeling the behaviors that will bring success? So that, is there low-hanging fruit, as we call it, that people there is something they can action and actually start to see a material change. And it's also celebrating that new beginning. Often people have launch parties or pizza parties, but something to really mark that now we're into the new. And that's it's like a celebration. It's like a new book launch. It's like any new product launch that you've honored the past, you've been through the transition. Now it's time to say, okay, here we go. And that's just the beginning. So you don't be dismayed or dissuaded by a reaction. So there is a difference, there's a distinction between reaction and resistance. Change will always cause a reaction because our brains are wired to keep us safe. So a change is perceived as a threat. And as I was talking earlier about the scarf, anybody who feels a threat to their status or their relationships or any of those parts of the scarf model, or if there's lack of fairness or in their sense of what's happening, it will put them into a stress response. And when people are under stress, they will move into their reactive tendencies. And that could be to just kind of comply or disappear or really try and please. And that can actually limit innovation. Or they can get critical or arrogant, or really, there's also distancing too. That might happen. And what I have to say that the criticism can be taken personally, and the leadership isn't to take that personally. It's a reaction to the threat or the stress response or some people just get doing. They might bury themselves in the work. They might put their head in the sand, but just different ways to understand and express the reaction. So it's important to identify and enable people to express the emotions that they have, but that's not resistance. So there's a lot of literature that says that some of the failures in change projects are directly attributed to the resistance of employees, and it's how you manage that resistance. Resistance isn't necessarily a bad thing. If we don't deal with it properly, it can actually just sabotage any change project. But if you start to really work with it and understand the source of the resistance and help the person work through it, the person who is the greatest resistor can actually become your greatest ally. The mobilizing people is the real work of change. This is the territory where we generally meet resistance. So when the rubber hits the road, that's when people go, oh, I don't know if I can do this. But it is a positive sign. And when I think about people going through the letting go process and starting the let come process, it's when they start to express fear and reticence and this resistance, they're starting to connect with their purpose, and they're starting to just demonstrate a commitment to the change if you respond appropriately. Resistance to change is useful because it helps clarify problems, it identifies other problems. It actually helps you to force you to think through. So dissenters, resistors, it's really, really important to listen to them so that we're not stepping into something that we shouldn't be stepping into at all. So they might be right, it might be a bad idea. And these are all the reasons why people resist change. It often is, they don't think it's necessary. It's their laws of fear that they'll lose some personal security and status. Again, all of the SCARF model, security, fairness, relationships, all of those things can cause resistance. And again, the more you engage them up front, the more likely they're going to be able to move with you and join in on the change versus resist the change. So what you have to do is listen for the signs. What are they saying about it? They'll often address change at an intellectual level when they're really struggling on a personal level. So our tendency sometimes as leaders is to address the issue, respond or react to what the person is saying intellectually. Instead, we invite you to be curious, to really use more of a coach approach and ask questions to get to understand what is at the root of that resistance. What is that? Getting back down again to what is at stake for them? What do they see as the concern, and where is that coming from? So I'm going to say respond, don't react. If you allow the person to express their resistance and be open and accepting to receive it, doesn't mean you need to agree with it. That could be enough to ease the resistance. And if not, it's really, again, going deeper into that kind of coach approach, helping people to understand and actually helping them to come up with some constructive suggestions to move forward. And this time, it's just the time to listen. So here are some of the strategies at a team level. Engage early and often. Communicate, communicate, communicate. That's the pushing out, but it's also listen, listen, listen. In the middle of a change process in an organization, it's really, really important to support the middle managers and coach them in how to navigate the change. They're also experiencing the change process and the grief that goes with change as well. So we have to make sure the senior leaders are supporting the middle leaders so that they can actually support the frontline staff. Establish formal and informal feedback loops. And then means often this is where individual support comes in. It could be through EAP, it could just be through mentorship, it could just be through buddying and making sure people have that space to share. And these are all the things that support people to change. They have an opportunity to contribute. They're hoping for translation into personal gain. And some people get excited about the challenge of something new, and they often will dance between guilt and excitement. So I'm excited about the new, but I'm feeling guilty by letting go of the old. If it makes sense to them, and if they respect the person who advocates for the change and they believe it's the right time. So just in closing, the most powerful tool we have to help others navigate change is ourselves. Our ability to use ourselves well is largely based on our level of self-awareness and the impact we have on others, as well as our ability to make choices in order to direct and modify this impact. So I want to thank you so much for attending, and I'll open the floor to questions.